Hey guys, we're going to dive into one of the very first VO designs I ever did. This is Battlecast Nasus.
Death is a harsh mistress. Journey into the beyond.
So we're going to look through this, see what stuff is still pretty sick, what stuff could have definitely been done better, and just kind of evaluate everything. So the first thing, let's listen to what the raw source was, because it definitely was not true raw source that I had to work with.
Death is a harsh mistress.
So there's a little verb, little stereo stuff going on, really beefy low end, and yeah, definitely not the best starting place, but these are the files that I had to work with. So one thing I did right off was up here on the stem track. This is where our audio files are starting their signal, and I threw a gate on. So normally it's sounding like, but with the gate, it's subtle, but it cuts off just enough to get rid of some annoying metallic ring out and just make it that ever so slightly tighter, which in a fast-paced game is important. So from our stem, it's going to route down to this main track, this high track, this clean track, which I don't end up using, but we'll get to that. And then it also routes to the low track. The three tracks in the middle here go into this bus, which is delayed by 20 milliseconds. And then both the delay comp and the low track feed into the voice bus. And then for absolutely no reason, they feed into the master bus, which has some master ring processing on there. That's simply for organization. This ozone could just be at the end of the signal chain, or the effects chain rather, of the voice. Cool, so let's start diving in and listen into some sounds. I'm going to leave the mastering processing on. It's mostly just final limiting and volume sets, but everything else we will start combing through. First of all, we'll take a listen to the main voice. No processing.
I bring death.
So this is vocal synth. I'm not going to really dive into what it's doing here, but basically I tweaked the knobs until it sounded really messed up. And the reason I chose to use this was because I was never able to get vocal synth to really work for me, and so I was determined to make it work. Next up, we're just getting rid of all of the little swirly swirls in the top end. And lastly, I'm collapsing this to mono and compressing it slightly. I didn't like how wide this voice was sounding. I wanted it to be the core of his power, as he's a giant robot dude. And I don't want the core of a power to be spread out everywhere. I want that sound to be very focused, like the core of a body. So that's our first layer. Our second layer here is going to bring in the intelligibility and a little bit of processing, but not too much. So once again, dry.
I bring death.
Then with our instance of trash, this is doing a couple things. One of them is it is distorting. Then it's filtering out the low end because our low end is already here. I don't need to bring in more low end from other tracks. So actually, let's go ahead and step through each one of these things. So first we are distorting.
I bring death.
It's pretty slight and it's only happening in this middle zone here.
I bring death.
I just wanted this to be slightly pushed because it is a layer about intelligibility. Sometimes you can also instead put it on this high layer. But for Nasus, his intelligibility definitely sat lower, and because robotic processing and metallic stuff is already so shrill, I didn't want to put distortion on the super high end and then just have to later go back and remove that with a de-esser or an EQ or something. So then we're filtering out the very low end. And then here I recorded some IRs myself. And this is either a stove shutting or the handle of the stove was really squeaky, and I can't remember which. I'm gonna put it at full mix first,
I bring death.
and then we'll go back
I bring death.
to 40% mix. I think it has a pretty cool
I bring death.
a pretty cool ambience that it's adding, but also I did it because I wanted to see if I could, and really that's all you need sometimes. And then some compression after that. We've got some de-essing and some EQ here. What is the purpose of EQ, right? Like, you see all these little humpy doos, and it's like, why are they there? What's going on? And I feel like I went a little overzealous on the EQ bands and some of this design. But on the other hand, I was intentionally trying to do things. So let's listen to what this band is doing. I'm trying to push the intelligibility through as much as possible, especially once we hear the last layer. There's going to be some competing frequencies, and so I want to be able to understand the voice.
I bring death.
Whoops. I'm pushing some body. I'm pushing some intelligibility. I assume that this, I'm just cutting some annoying S's, and then once again, I'm reducing some of the low end. I probably could have done this in like 1 or maybe 2 steps instead of the multiple steps that it ends up happening. And then we got some compression and pitching up the formant in this. So this is kind of interesting.
I bring death.
That's without.
I bring death.
That's with. I can't actually hear a difference here.
I bring death. I bring death. I bring.
So I'm pushing this more to hear it.
I bring death.
So honestly, it is such a small push that I don't even know if I needed this, but I was trying to get this voice away from the old boring core voice.
I bring death.
Sorry, the old voice isn't boring. I'm trying to spice it up. And doing that in as many little steps, because people always talk about, oh, it's better to do like 10 little steps than 5 big ones. And there is some truth to that, but I think I was maybe following that advice a little too closely. There is one other thing it might do, which we may or may not end up testing, which when we hear the next voice, having these two voices differentiate their timbre a little bit. So what does the next voice sound like? First, we'll play it all together.
I bring death.
So that's where the beefy boy voice comes from. Let's play them together real quick.
I bring death. I bring death. I bring death.
Yeah, I can't really hear a difference with that pitch shifter. I see what I was trying to do, but I think I could have definitely pushed it farther. So what's going on in this low voice here? Well, first of all, we're adding a little more smoke.
I bring death.
Since the vocal synth layer is completely mono, and that's our other sort of crunchy core layer.
Your spirit.
Whoops. So that boy there is super center, and so now I'm trying to make another similar-ish kind of texture layer that is filling up the stereo field, so we can have a difference between those two things.
Your spirit is hollow.
Well, he's a robot, so how about getting those vocal cords moving a little bit more mechanically?
Your spirit is hollow.
And once again, he's a robot, so distortion.
Your spirit is
I can't even really hear that. That probably could have been turned up a bit. And then pitch shifting, because if we want to separate the main voice, which is this,
your spirit.
or the high voice as it's labeled, we want to separate that intelligibility as much as we can from all of the effects that are filling in around the voice. Whoops.
I bring death.
And then for some reason, I thought it would be a good idea to add another pitch shifter that pitches it up slightly.
I bring death.
My thought process behind this is pitch delay is a pitch and a delay. and it has it adds a little bit of tremolo-ish sound to it. So I've got a tremolo into the pitch delay. So it's like two tremolos kind of fighting with each other. I'm trying to, this is my early attempts at sort of randomization. And then after that, I was thinking, okay, well, if I've got a pitch algorithm, what if we did two pitch algorithms and see how those interact? I think that they interact cool with each other, but that could also just be in my head because I worked on it and that's what my goal was.
Soon there will be nothing.
So sometimes it can be cool to stack similar effects, like 3 different choruses from 3 different plugins and see how they interact with each other. And sometimes it's just overkill. And in this instance, I probably could have cut back. Dirt is a fun plugin for me. I don't really know what it does. Well, it's a distortion, but the knobs just kind of have cool sounds and I turn them until they sound cool. Sound design doesn't always have to be complicated.
Soon there will be nothing.
I especially like how this dirt picks up on like harsh sounds like the T here.
Your spirit is hollow.
The spirit.
Spirit is hollow. It is never ending.
It just has this little echo crunch that it adds around the sibilants because there's already verbs and stuff swirling around. As we add on more of the distortions, the effect becomes even more pronounced. Here's an instance of choral that I was trying to add a bit more of the robotic sound to, but I think the mix is too low.
It is never ending.
If we turn it up,
It is never ending.
it's like, that's what it's doing, but it's so slight, I think it could have been pushed. And trying to duck out of the way of the intelligibility high end and push the mids for the boxy feel and cut the lows. Because I was trying to make as much room just for the vocoder, which is what I was dedicating the lows to. Lastly, just we're not going to dive into this, but this is a layer.
It is never ending.
So it's pretty much clean, slightly distorted, and has a tremolo. And I was trying to use that as a clean intelligibility layer, but the tremolo ended up just making it harder to understand instead of easier. So ultimately I ended up muting that track and not shipping with it. So the other thing that's going on here is, like I said, this delay comp is delaying by 20 milliseconds. And this is super helpful. You can put children tracks under this parent and use the delay offset, or probably what would be better is using Reaper has something called time adjustment delay. And you can just do the exact same thing where it's literally just delays the signal or makes the signal come a little earlier. And that would be better because then you would see there's an effect on this track. Whereas if I see this as delay comp, but I have to click into the routing to then see, oh, okay, I did actually delay that. When I was first looking at this session and digging it back up, I thought I just had left it named that and forgotten why. But as I was digging through the track manager, I happened to see that the offset is at 20 milliseconds, so there was a reason. So what is that reason? Well, I like the sound of the pitch delay, as I've said earlier, and it is a pitch and a delay. So since it's delaying by about 25 milliseconds, that was just enough offset to make the voices not glue together as well as I wanted them to. And so by offsetting all the other sounds, which in this case is just 2 other tracks, then all of the tracks can play together as one single voice. Let's go ahead and see if that actually worked or if I was being too particular.
It is never ending. It is never ending.
So I'm only going to play that one example because it's hard to click back and forth. Actually, we'll go and do it one more time. I can do this.
It is never ending. It is never ending. It is never ending. It is never ending.
I can definitely hear that it is more aligned, and I'm actually glad that I made that choice. So good job, Austin, from 3 years ago. Lastly, we have way too many plugins on our bus here. I am once again using trash, but this time I'm just saturating all the bands equally, putting in a tiny, tiny mix of this IR because I felt like it, and doing a little bit of compression.
It is never ending.
Before,
It is.
after,
It is never.
there's probably some glue happening. I can't hear it easily on just that one thing. A little bit of compression, more compression and de-essing. We've got a very slight amount of stereo movement. So one thing that's kind of weird about League is some of the old champions have mono files and stereo files mixed, and that's just how it is. And so if I want some of these mono files to sound stereo, I have to add in that stereo imaging myself somewhere in the effects plane, effects chain.
My bite is worse than my bark.
Let's hear what this sounds like cranked.
I walk through the ages. I walk through the ages.
Pretty subtle. Doing a very similar thing with ROM. It has a feedback and is it has a pre-delay here of about the robot length pre-delay and a tiny bit of reverb, and then a distortion.
I walk through the ages.
Lastly, trying to tame the low end a bit, taming the low end again, and cleaning up a little bit of boxiness that I probably added earlier and wouldn't have needed to cut out, and gluing it together with some compression. Ozone is just doing typical mastering stuff, so we're not going to dive too deeply into that. But let's go ahead, and the last thing we'll do is listen to a couple of the tracks, and as we mix them together and turn the effects on and off. So everything together.
Your spirit is hollow.
Actually, I think this one is good.
This too must end.
Then we'll just listen to each layer.
This too must end. This too must end.
And then turning off the mastering,
This too must end.
or the bus processing rather, and then turning it on.
This too must end.
So that was one of my first designs. I think it's cool to look back at your work after a couple years and see where you've come from and what you were doing well and what you could have improved on. Overall, I think that my ideas were in a good place, but I had too many plugins and I could have pushed the plugins I was using a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's the main takeaway that I'm bringing from here. Some other smaller things. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something.